On Monday, October 9th, 1893, before the sun could settle its heat over the pines of Tallapoosa County, the teacher Alma Reeves pushed open the door of the wooden community schoolhouse near the packed dirt road that led to Dadeville, along the stretch where fine dust lay over the boards and clung to shoes. The latch scraped as always, worn metal against dried wood. But that morning the sound seemed different because outside there were too many footsteps, a coming and going of soles and bare feet on the porch floor, a gathering of people that did not match the size of the building. Boys in borrowed boots and girls in patched dresses pressed in there. And more were still coming along the path, some barefoot, carrying younger siblings on a hip, faces marked by sleep and by the soot of the kitchen stove. The blackboard, worn and stained by years of chalk, waited for a list of names that would not fit. The room had long benches made of plain boards and a single wood stove in the corner, its pipe rising to the roof, and Alma knew, even before she took off her shawl, that there would not be enough firewood for so many people that winter, that the notebooks would run out in a few weeks, and that if she could not secure more class time and some kind of agreement with the men who decided things in the area, that crowd would end up turning into noise and quitting. That school existed by promise and effort, not by abundance, sustained by contributions and by what the district agreed to recognize. And since the price of cotton had collapsed in the spring and then again at the end of summer, families had been crowding into the same districts, combining relatives, sharing rented land and subsistence plots, pushed by debts recorded in store ledgers and by promissory notes that came due without mercy, things no one could explain without lowering their eyes. The school sat on a piece of land donated years earlier by a local farmer, a rectangle of unpainted boards with tall, narrow windows to catch light and reduce heat, and gaps that, in cold weather, let the wind in. Behind it, there was a shallow well with a bucket and rope, and an oak tree where the children left their tin lunch pails in the shade so they would not get too hot. The road was only hardened mud and wheel ruts. When it rained, it became a ribbon of sticky clay that trapped wagons and delayed everything, from the mail to trips to the courthouse. That October, the weather alternated cool mornings and afternoons with persistent flies. Alma walked down the narrow aisle between the benches, counting places in her head. There were 36 if the little ones sat tight and agreed to share space. On the porch, she had already seen more than 50 faces. The fall in cotton, spoken of in murmurs in Dadeville's general stores and on the post office steps, had become something concrete inside that room. More children asking to come in, more hands held out for a pencil, more eyes waiting for the teacher to find a way, just as store credit shrank and cash circulated less. Alma was 26, her hair pinned in a simple bun, and she addressed the room in a way that was neither gentle nor harsh, only steady, like someone who had learned not to waste words when class time was short and noise came easily. She lived with her aunt in a small house half a mile away and crossed the field every morning with a cloth bag carrying chalk, a reading book already without a cover, and an apple when there was one, along with an inkwell and pen when she could manage to keep ink. She was known for keeping the school open beyond the scheduled weeks, gathering small contributions from parents, persuading merchants to extend credit for paper and charcoal, accepting payment in provisions when money was scarce. But that year was not like the others. In July, men came back from the markets in Opelika and Montgomery, saying cotton was worth almost nothing, that buyers were offering prices that did not even cover fertilizer in the store account. The word panic had appeared in crumpled newspapers brought in someone's pocket from Birmingham, and what people said about banks closing and credit drying up reached the countryside as an immediate restriction. Less credit, more collection, more urgency. Alma did not read the newspaper often, but she heard its effect in conversation, as if the news became a rule of life. People talking about promissory notes coming due without forgiveness and about accounts piling up. What reached the school was simpler and crueler. Children who had once arrived clean and with a notebook of their own now shared pages, erased carefully to reuse them. And some simply stopped coming because they had to pick corn, fetch firewood, mind the little ones while their parents tried to negotiate with the landowner or the merchant who wrote everything down. When Alma opened the windows, the smell of earth and distant smoke came in, from burning field remnants and from stoves lit early. She set the inkwell on the desk and began writing the day's rules on the board. But the last word came out crooked when the chalk broke. She gathered the pieces and put them away, because chalk was not something to waste. Outside, a dry cough repeated, someone who was not a child. Alma also heard the creak of a wagon stopping, wooden wheel complaining, and the murmur of adult voices. The community schoolhouse was at once a place to learn and a place to meet. Their people discussed roads, harvests, illness, marriage, and sometimes someone read aloud a notice brought from the courthouse. But that morning the adults had not come to talk. They had come to ask, and the request already weighed before it was spoken. When class began, the front bench filled with the little ones, some 7 years old, wide-eyed, hands in their laps, clothes adjusted with pins and re-sewn seams. The older ones spread out as they could, teenagers already as tall as men, and still carrying penmanship notebooks with shaky letters, because attendance was interrupted by work and by season. Alma called names and wrote them on a list. Some surnames repeated. Henderson, Pike, McCants, and the Turners, newly arrived from near Alexander City, having left a tenancy they could not pay, pushed by an account and a poor crop. The room filled to the last patch of floor, and still 3 boys stood near the door. Alma made a short gesture to reorganize places, directing with signs and hand motions, so the smaller children took the benches and the larger ones alternated standing and sitting in turns. Need did not allow for long delicacies. The children obeyed with contained shoving. Like those who understood everything, there was provisional and depended on adult temper and weather. Alma handed out what she had, pieces of charcoal for those without pencils, loose sheets torn from old notebooks for those with nothing. With each handoff, she felt the supply shrink like water in a cracked bucket and knew the district would not replace it on its own, not without pressure, not without someone taking responsibility. At recess, near the oak, the parents who had come were waiting. One of them, Josiah Pike, hat crushed, beard unshaven, held a sack of dried corn, something that served as food and as payment. Another, Deacon Ezra Collins, a middle-aged man with clean hands and a well-pressed shirt despite the dust, was a kind of informal leader, owner of a small store on the road, and responsible for organizing collections for the church, used to dealing with account books and payment deadlines. There was also Lila Turner, thin, with a child on her hip, and another clinging to her skirt, hollow-eyed from too little sleep and the weight of a crowded house. They approached carefully, not like people looking for a fight, but like people cornered. From their movements and the way they looked toward the classroom door, the request took shape without ornament. The school needed to accept everyone, and they needed to know what would be required in return, because nothing there was guaranteed by county paper. Alma kept her chin up and stated, in a few sentences, what had been weighing since early morning. The school would not shut its door to the children brought by the community, but it would need notebooks, firewood, and more weeks of class than the scheduled term. Ezra nodded slowly and noted that the district had not sent notebooks that year, citing lack of county funds, something repeated when the budget tightened and priorities lay elsewhere. Alma had heard the same phrase 2 weeks earlier on the Dadeville courthouse steps, when she had tried to speak with a clerk who barely lifted his head, busy with papers and the flow of people. The county said it had no funds, but the lack of funds always fell first on the school. Lila, tightening the child at her arms, made it plain by the way she fixed her eyes on the ground and then on the door that a closed school meant boys going to the fields too early and never coming back, because work held them and reading was not required to plant, and what was not required was the first thing abandoned. There, under the oak, Ezra pointed to a practical solution. There would be a meeting on Saturday, October 14th, at Bethlehem Church, near the creek, with the district men present. Alma knew those men. They were not famous, nor rich like the big planters, but they had influence. The local justice of the peace, the road overseer, the man who kept the keys to the community would shed. They were the ones who decided whether the school would get another load of boards, whether someone could cut trees in a common area, whether the teacher would receive part of the money raised at a cattle auction or in a church collection. Alma also knew that, in those meetings, a woman's voice was treated as a tolerable nuisance when convenient. Even so, she decided she would be there, because the alternative was to accept shrinking as fate. That night, at her aunt's house, Alma sat at the table under a kerosene lamp and reviewed the accounts in a black-covered notebook. There were small numbers, carefully written, $2.20 from a collection in August, 50 cents from a merchant, a sack of flour given by a widow, things that came in as they could, in coin and in kind. What was missing was larger than what existed. She heard her aunt moving in the kitchen, clanging a pot, and the silence of the field outside, broken by crickets. Alma took a loose sheet and wrote a list of what she would ask for: 12 notebooks, 6 boxes of pencils, 2 sacks of charcoal, a load of firewood, extension of the term through February. Then she wrote another list, harder, 1 more bench, roof repair, paint for the board, things that required material and labor. She knew she would not get everything, but she also knew that if she asked for little, she would receive even less, because negotiation in the district was always downward, always trying to push need to later, as if later were a safe place. On Saturday, October 14th, the sky dawned clear and the air smelled of dry leaves. Bethlehem Church was a simple building, with wooden pews and a small bell, and the boards creaked under the weight of people coming and going. Beside it, a cemetery with low headstones, some without names, marked only by stone or weathered wood. Wagons lined up in the field, horses with flies on their backs. Alma arrived on foot, in her Sunday dress, and carrying a paper folder wrapped in cloth. The men were gathered near the door, speaking low. There was the justice of the peace, Harlan Boone, a heavy man with a mustache who always seemed to be sweating. Wade Sutter, responsible for organizing road maintenance, with thick hands of someone who worked but liked to command. And the pastor, Reverend Miles, who tried to keep the conversation on the path of the common good without offending anyone, because he depended on the same community to support the church and knew the cost of making enemies. Alma waited until the pastor called everyone inside. The meeting began with a short prayer. Then came the list of matters: the bridge over the creek that needed boards, the case of a stolen pig, a complaint about a stray dog, things that in a rural district ended up on the same table and in the same ear. The school came in as the last item, almost as an afterthought, and that place in the order already said a great deal. The pastor signaled that the teacher would have space to present her need, and Alma stood. The sound of pews shifting was like a wave moving through the room. She opened the folder and held the list with both hands so it would not tremble, because she knew any hesitation would be used as weakness, and weakness there became an excuse to delay. She presented the number of children enrolled since October 9th, 63, and compared it to the existing benches, 36. She reported that the district had not sent notebooks, and that the firewood promised the year before was gone, consumed by cold and daily use. She explained that if the term ended in December, half the children would not return, because interruption became abandonment, and abandonment became the rule. Wade Sutter reacted with visible disbelief, and Alma, without fixing on him, supported the figure with a list of names and with the simple evidence of what was seen every day in the room, shoulder pressed to shoulder. Boone, tugging at his vest, returned to the argument already used. The county had no money. Alma placed the matter at the level where it truly existed in that district. If the county did not supply, the community would have to decide whether the school would continue to exist with notebooks, firewood, and time, or whether only an empty building would remain, boards in the wind, and children at work before their age. Discomfort ran along the pews, not as outrage, but as people being forced to face what they had been avoiding. The pastor, hand on his hat, guided the conversation toward what was being asked in practical terms. Alma listed the immediate minimum: notebooks and pencils to begin, firewood before the cold, and the more sensitive request, extension of the term with payment guaranteed in money or provisions because a teacher also ate and needed kerosene and soap. She added the need for written permission to cut firewood in the common area near the creek, so no one would back out when the cold tightened and need became dispute, and so a spoken word would not be undone at the first inconvenience. Sutter crossed his arms and showed concern about disorder and cost, and Boone calculated the risk of non-payment in a year when cotton paid nothing and corn barely yielded, and when the store account grew. Before the meeting could close in excuses, Ezra Collins stood from the back and offered concrete bridge. The store could extend credit for paper if the community guaranteed payment by the corn harvest, and the church could organize a firewood collection, each family bringing a bundle per week. Boone was not easily convinced, but the alternative, a closed school, children without reading, boys in the field from age 8, was a consequence already pressing against the district, and no one wanted to be the man who would claim it out loud. The pastor moved the vote forward as if it were just another maintenance item, but the weight was different. The decision came in pieces, like everything in that time. It was agreed that Ezra Collins would provide notebooks and pencils on credit at cost, with payment in corn or labor. Sutter would authorize, in writing, the cutting of firewood in a specific strip near the creek, limited to certain families, to prevent abuse and to keep the common area from becoming no one's land. The term could be extended through the end of January, not February, and Alma's pay would be partly money collected at church and partly provisions. It was less than she wanted, but it was more than nothing, and she knew how to measure the difference. She put the authorization paper away, folded 4 times, and felt its weight as if it were a fragile promise, dependent on mood and memory, but still a promise. The following week, the room remained crowded. Alma reorganized the routine with precision. Reading for the little ones in the morning, arithmetic for the older ones after midday, penmanship in groups, dictation for everyone at the end. The stove was not yet necessary, but she was already training the children to bring a piece of firewood when the cold arrived, because an agreement on paper did not fill the wood corner. Some came with twigs, others with chunks of log carried with effort. The credited notebooks began to appear, one by one, delivered by Ezra in brown paper bundles like goods that had to be protected from damp. Alma handed them out as if they were rare valuables, and they were. The children smelled the new paper, ran a hand over the cover, and for an instant seemed to forget the rest, as if clean paper were a promise of order in a world coming apart. At the end of October, a hard rain fell for 2 days, turning the road into a mire. The school stood empty on Friday, October 27th, because wagons could not pass and the mud trapped even those on foot. Alma used the time to patch the roof with scraps of wood and bent nails, working where water had stained the boards. On Saturday, the weather cleared, but the air stayed damp and cold. That was when the coughs began. First, a small boy, Eli McCants, with a running nose, sitting near the unlit stove. Then 2 Turner girls, coughing dryly, as if their chests were full of dust and cold. Alma sent notes home asking for rest, but rest was a luxury. Mothers needed help washing clothes, fetching water, cooking. Fathers needed hands for the field and for cutting wood. The children returned before they were better, bringing the cold inside them, and the room, closed to hold heat, became a place of heavy air where illness moved easily. In early November, the promised firewood still had not arrived. Families brought bundles, but not enough to keep the stove burning all day. Alma began teaching with frozen hands, holding the chalk as if it were something alive, and the ink in the inkwell thickened in the cold. On November 6, 1893, a Monday, the wind came from the north, cutting, and the children came in stamping their feet to warm up, ears red and fingers stiff. The stove was lit with difficulty, smoke escaping through a crack in the pipe. Alma opened the window a little so the room would not choke, and cold air came in, mixed with the smell of burning pine and ash, a reminder that warmth inside was always a negotiation. That same day, late in the afternoon, Alma went to the common area near the creek with the authorization in her pocket and a borrowed axe. Ezra Collins and two younger men were already there, cutting fallen trunks and splitting them into lengths that could be carried. The ground was damp, and leaves stuck to shoes. They worked in silence, focused because the work was direct and time was short. It was a kind of agreement that did not depend on speeches. The district did not give, so the community took from what it had, within the marked limit, try to keep the school warm without turning need into dispute. That was when Wade Sutter appeared, coming down the path with two young men. He carried a shotgun on his shoulder, not aimed, but present, as was common when traveling and as a sign of authority in a place where authority was often personal. He stopped near the bank and looked at the woodpile. From his posture and the way he examined the cutting strip, it was clear he judged it excessive. Ezra straightened his back and indicated, with a tilt of the head, that they were within the marked area and that the teacher had the paper. Alma took the authorization from her pocket and held it out, without stepping too close. Sutter did not take it. He only looked as if the paper were an affront, as if writing were not enough to restrain the urge to command, and as if permission, because it was permission, could be revoked by the simple act of disapproval. Sutter pointed to what he considered a violation. Living wood being cut down, not only fallen trunks. One of the young men, sweating, reacted too quickly, saying the tree had given way in the recent rain, and the cut was to make use of what was already compromised. Sutter stepped forward, the shotgun still on his shoulder, but his body tense. The cold wind crossed the space between them and made the leaves scrape along the ground. Alma recognized the kind of fear that came not only from the gun, but from hunger and pride, which left any argument ready to turn violent. She placed herself between what was needed and what could explode, holding to the simple idea that the wood was for the children and that if there was another way, it had to be set there, not later, because later was always too late and the cold did not wait. The next instant was a short chain of mistakes. One of the young men with Sutter, nervous, moved at the shotgun as if to help hold it or get it out of the way. The motion was wrong, too fast. There was a dry crack, followed by a sound that cut the air like a whip. A bird lifted from a brush. Ezra Collins dropped to his knees, his hand going to his chest, his face shifting into wordless surprise. Blood appeared dark on the light shirt, spreading slowly, like spilled ink, and the cold seemed to stop for a second, as if the world needed a moment to understand what had already been done. No one screamed. The silence was heavy, unable to accommodate what had happened. The young man who fired stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth open. Sutter let the shotgun slip from his shoulder and looked at Ezra on the ground as if he wanted to deny it with his gaze. Alma knelt beside Ezra without touching him at first, as if the body might break. She saw the blood and understood, with terrible clarity, that this was not a cut. It was a wound that could not be fixed with cloth and cold water. Ezra tried to draw air, but the effort came short. Alma took his hand and, with the other, made urgent signs for someone to fetch a wagon, because there was nothing there but improvisation, and improvisation had limits. The wagon came. Ezra was laid on boards and covered with a coat. The path to the road was uneven, and then the wagon went on to Dadeville, to the nearest doctor, a trip that on a dirt road and in cold wind consumed time no one had. Alma walked alongside for part of the way, her hands smeared with blood, the firewood cutting authorization still folded in her pocket, now useless, as if the paper had lost its meaning in the same instant the shot went off. The wind kept blowing as if nothing had changed, and that indifference of the weather only made everything heavier. Ezra Collins died that night, November 6th, 1893, before midnight, in the back room of Dr. J.T. Ware's office in Dadeville, where care was limited to what a small-town doctor could do in the face of a gunshot wound to the chest. The news reached the district the next morning, carried by mouths speaking low, as if speaking loudly might summon more misfortune. Ezra's store closed, door locked and shelves without movement. The widow was left with 3 children and an account book that made no sense without him, with names and amounts that depended on collection and trust. The community lost the man who had extended credit for paper, who had organized firewood, who had been a bridge between need and decision. The death was not only loss. It was a rupture in a fragile mechanism that kept the school breathing, and the district felt it as if a part had been torn from a machine already failing. On Wednesday, November 8th, Alma opened the school anyway. The children came in with unusual quiet. Some had heard. Others only felt the weight in the adults and the change in the way their parents walked. The bench where Ezra used to sit when he came to check on class remained empty, like a visible hole. Alma wrote reading exercises on the board, but the chalk seemed rougher, as if even the sound of the line had changed. At recess, Lila Turner appeared with red eyes, carrying a small sack of beans. She set it on the desk with a short gesture and stood for a moment, as if there were no words possible for what had happened. The offering, simple, was what remained when comfort had no shape and food was the only safe language. In the days that followed, the shot was discussed on porches and in the courthouse yard. Wade Sutter tried to hold to the version of an accident, blaming it on the young man's nervousness. The young man, Thomas Mize, 19 years old, was seen moving like a shadow, not meeting anyone's eyes, as someone who knew the whole district was measuring him. Justice of the Peace Harlan Boone spoke of misfortune and of avoiding more trouble. There was no immediate arrest. There was no swift justice. What there was a pulling back. Men avoiding meetings, families afraid to cut wood even with authorization. The church divided between those who wanted to forget and those who wanted to point, because pointing could also bring retaliation. And in that retreat, need did not lessen. It only became more solitary. For the school, the consequence was direct. Without Ezra, the credited notebook stopped. The closed store meant there was nowhere to get paper on credit, nowhere to record a promise of payment. Alma began collecting used sheets, asking the children to write smaller, to erase and reuse, and saving the least worn pages for those who still could not form letters. The stove was lit only in the first hours to save firewood. On November 20th, a cold front came down and frost lay white on the field at dawn. The children arrived with purple fingers, and Alma had them stand near the stove in turns, as if it were medicine, because the heat was scarce and had to be divided, and because cold, once it settles in, does not argue. The district's morale, already weakened by poverty, grew more fragile from guilt. Alma, who was not related to Ezra, felt a heavy responsibility all the same. She had asked for firewood and time, She had set people in motion. Now there was a dead man. It was not simple blame, but it was a fact that sat with her at the table at night, when the lamp flame trembled and the kerosene ran low. Even so, she kept going to school because there was no other path but abandonment, and abandonment was a kind of loss that spread without noise, without a single shot, but with the same result over the years. In December, the school was supposed to end the term. The agreement made on October 14th said it would run through the end of January, but now no one wanted to speak of agreements. Church money was used to help Ezra's widow because her need was immediate and visible. The firewood collection diminished because families were tired and afraid of quarrels, and because work in the cold cost more. Alma realized that if she waited for the men to meet again, she would lose the most important weeks of winter. So she did what could be done by a teacher in a rural district in 1893. She went house to house, walking muddy paths and grass tracks, accepting each person's time, measuring her words so as not to turn a request into an affront. On December 5, 1893, under a gray sky with the smell of rain, Alma walked to the Pikes' home, a cabin with gaps stuffed with cloth and old newspaper, try to hold back the wind. Josiah Pike was on the porch, repairing a harness with hard hands, leather, and buckle, the work of someone who could not afford to lose an animal or a tool. He watched her cautiously, and his worry showed in the way he looked at her bag and then toward the school road. Alma removed her shawl as a sign she would stay only as long as necessary, and presented the request as a practical commitment, without meeting and without dispute. A bundle of firewood per week from each family that could manage it, a handful of corn when there was any to keep the teacher fed, and the children's attendance even in the cold, because the cold passed, and what was not learned did not return. Josiah, shoulders tense since Ezra's death, made it clear no one wanted more trouble. Alma held, without hardness, only as a statement, that the trouble had already happened, and what remained was to decide whether the children would pay for it. He went inside and came back with 2 pieces of log tied with rope, setting them at her feet as if that gesture were the only answer possible. A payment in wood, not in words, and still a commitment. She repeated the visit at other houses. Some doors stayed shut. Some women handed over a little lard, a cloth for mending, a candle, things that helped carry a week. Some men said they had nothing. Alma did not argue. She only kept a mental map of what each family could bear, because pressing too hard broke what little cooperation remained. Over time, small bundles began to appear on the school porch, left early, without announcement, as if the district were ashamed of its own need to cooperate and preferred help to look casual, almost accidental, so as not to admit how much they depended on one another. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Alma held a short class. The children recited reading passages and sang a simple hymn, softly, more to fill the air than to celebrate, because celebration required surplus that almost no one had. There were no gifts, only an orange divided into small pieces for the little ones, donated by someone who had obtained it in Dadeville, fruit not common on a winter table in the countryside. The stove was lit, and for a moment the room seemed a protected place from the world, despite the cold boards and the gaps. At the end, Alma handed out sheets with exercises for a 2-day recess. Her wish for that Christmas stayed contained in the way she watched each face leave through the door. That no one would fall ill, that no one would be absent from hunger, that winter would not take more than it already had, and that the school would not become only a memory. In early January 1894, the rains returned and the road turned bad again. Even so, the school continued. The term extended through the end of the month was fulfilled with effort, with absences on muddy days and attendance on days of dry cold. Alma taught fractions with corn kernels on the desk, reading with an old Bible borrowed from the church, writing with charcoal when pencils ran out, and save the few pencils for exercises that required more precision. Some children quit, taken to work in houses where there was food. Others stayed, stubborn, because the school was the only place where the future took the shape of words and numbers, even if the present was only labor, and even if the future seemed too distant to trust. Ezra's death did not resolve itself as it does in books. On January 12th, there was a hearing at the Dadeville courthouse. Thomas Mize was called and kept to the version of an accident, breaking inwardly in a way that showed in trembling hands and lowered eyes before men who recorded and judged. Wade Sutter reinforced the same line, insisting on misfortune. Boone wrote down the essentials on paper, as if the record were enough to close it. The young man was not sentenced to a long prison term. He left with a fine and a quiet agreement no one described in detail. Ezra's widow received a small sum and more promises than money. The district accepted it because it was tired and because it needed to keep planting something, even if cotton was worthless, and because prolonging conflict cost more than it could pay. Justice in that place and time was not a straight line. It was a tangle of survival and convenience, with the law applied within the limits of what the community would tolerate and what the community feared. On the last day of class, January 31st, 1894, the sky was clear and the wind less cutting. Alma arrived early and lit the stove, more from habit than need, and swept the floor before the children came in. The children entered with lighter steps, as if they knew a cycle was ending and that, for a time, the building would be quiet. She called each one to read a sentence. Some stumbled, others managed without effort. A boy who in October had barely recognized letters now read a short paragraph, slowly but complete. One of the Turner girls wrote her own name in a firm hand for the first time. They were small victories, but they were the only ones that district could count that winter, measured in syllables and strokes, not in money, and for that very reason they seemed more real. After class, Alma was alone in the room. The floor bore marks of dried mud. The blackboard was coated with chalk dust, and a corner by the stove held accumulated ash. She swept slowly, as if the motion helped put things in their proper place, and in without fuss because there almost nothing ended with ceremony. On the desk there was a sack of corn, 2 pieces of soap, a dishcloth, and a 50-cent coin, payments left over the month, a mixture of kind and cash. There was also a new notebook, blue cover, without a name, left by someone. Alma opened it and saw blank, clean pages waiting. She closed it carefully and put it in her bag, not as possession, but as possible continuity if the district could endure another year and if paper did not become an impossible luxury. On the following Sunday, February 4th, 1894, Bethlehem Church held a small ceremony for Ezra Collins. Not a funeral because the body had been buried for months, but a remembrance, an attempt to give shape to what had been interrupted and to keep the community united enough to go on. The widow sat on the front bench, hands clenched in her lap. The school children sang a hymn softly. Alma stood at the back, watching people's shoulders, the way some men avoided looking directly at the family, the way women held their children as if they wanted to keep the world from taking them too, because the world had already shown it could, and that there was not always a way to stop it. On Monday, Alma did not open the school. The term had ended and the agreement had been fulfilled to its limit. She stayed home, writing simple reports on brown paper to send to the county office, knowing perhaps no one would read them, but that the record was part of the work, and that sometimes the record was the only thing left when memory became rumor. She noted the number of children served, the weeks open, the needs for the next year. Benches, roof, notebooks, firewood. Beside it, on a separate sheet, she wrote the name Ezra Collins and the date November 6th, 1893, as if recording were a way to keep it from becoming only porch talk and to keep the sequence of facts in order, because order that winter had been hard to hold. Winter went on. Families planted what they could, preparing the ground when weather allowed. Some men went to Birmingham to try for work in the steel mills, returning or not returning, because outside money was a hope when cotton failed. The price of cotton stayed low, and the district stayed tight, with relatives sharing yards and stoves. The community schoolhouse remained standing, boards creaking in the wind, waiting for the next term as if waiting were a function, and as if the building itself were an insistence against shrinking. When March came, the mud dried, and the first insects returned to the air. Alma walked to the schoolhouse one clear afternoon and opened the door to air it out. The smell of cold wood and old ash was still there, mixed with chalk dust. She set the blue-covered notebook on the desk, opened to the first page, and wrote, in small, firm handwriting, an inventory of what remained, as if it were an accounting of survival. Then she closed it and looked out the window at the field, where children ran after a chicken, laughing for a moment without any larger reason. Ezra's death had left a space that would not be filled, and poverty continued like a long shadow. But there was also that room, that board, that notebook waiting to be used, and a teacher who had learned, in body and routine, that negotiating for notebooks, firewood, and class time was more than managing a school. It was holding a thin line between what was lost and what could still be kept. When Alma locked the door and slipped the key into her pocket, the latch sounded the same as always, simple and dry, and yet it seemed final, marking the end of a winter in which the district had passed through hardship, carrying the weight of an irreversible shot, and, despite it, keeping lit a small flame of order inside a crowded room. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.